welcome all those who we sadly can't see, but I can see that we've got a good attendance once again for this, the fourth lecture in our series. We are here to hear about gardens old and new, and I suppose having started to look at buildings and those who are working around it with Tim at the beginning of this series, and we've had some fascinating lectures in between, it's now, I suppose, fitting to draw it back to the all-important context in which a lot of these buildings were sat in, but actually more importantly to really understand some of the context around which Lutyens was responding to. We've obviously heard much of the work with Jekyll, who, the work is here on the screen in front of us. But luckily, we are in the company of Michael Balston, who, as Senior Director of, I have to say, an absolutely fantastic landscape design and garden design practice, Balston Aegis, qualified as an architect, so very well versed to give his strong opinions on that, but then moved into landscape design. He's recently completed 10 years as the Councillor of the RHS and was chair of the Show Garden Committee, and he's also one of the vice presidents of the RHS now. So really, credentials flowing fast. He's written extensively, and lucky we can add to the lectures that he's given tonight. So before handing over, a minor bit of housekeeping. Please add your Q&As to the Q&A box at the bottom. As I said at the beginning, we're recording this lecture, and recording link will be sent around to everyone who's attended or those who have paid but haven't been able to record come tonight. Thanks to the Lutyens Trust America for letting us use this again. And so without further ado, I hand over to you, Michael. Take us away.
Well, hello to you all, and thank you for that, Robbie. You say too much too kindly. I have no idea how many of you there are, but there's a lot of knocking on screens as you try and get out. I can hear it. It sounds like my screen has got a bad dose of Death Watch Beetle. However, this painting, which you see in front of you, is by George Elgood, who was a prominent artist around 1900. And it shows the Michaelmas Daisy Garden at Munstead Wood, which was part of Gertrude Jekyll's extraordinary creation that changed the direction of gardening for the next 100 years. You'll recognize Gardens Old and New as the title of the 3 volumes published by Country Life in 1900 onwards, in several editions. It's a useful place to start, as many of the gardens shown are exactly what the Arts and Crafts garden was reacting against. But also shown are important inspirations for the movement and examples of the new garden. The garden at Athelhampton here, laid out by Inigo Thomas in the 1890s, is a good example of what the volumes cover. This space has the topical name of the Corona Garden. At this time, there was a multiplicity of architectural styles on the go. Gardens were similarly diverse until the arts and crafts movement emerged to become a functionally versatile approach to both home and garden making, suitable for gardens large and small. In some respects, its principles still persist. Whatever the designer's vision and skill with plants and materials, the context of the work is always important. This encompasses not only the client's agenda, but also the site and its characteristics, not only the immediate history of the site, but also the historical context, which often shines a light on the reasoning behind the form we have inherited. The development of gardens in the 19th century and through the arts and crafts period is incredibly rich with wonderful artists, designers, and contractors. This talk will explore the historical context and the people that gave shape to design-led arts and crafts gardens, and also the plant-led horticultural collections. And we will see how, as the movement gave way to modernism in public architecture, its principles remain strong in private domestic work. It's not just the topography, geology, and vegetation that reveal solutions to landscape design issues, but also the history. Some idea about the physical and cultural development of landscapes and gardens helps both an understanding of a site and its future development. However, may I be clear that I make no claim to be a historian. I am, as a designer, more a user of history. History helps us understand why a site has come to look the way it does. There might be archaeological or cultural issues to consider. Ancient infrastructure or drainage may be a critical constraint. Quite a bit can be gleaned from maps, prints, letters, and so on, like these for the Grove in Hertfordshire, where I worked at one stage and to which I will return later. The 1880 Ordnance Survey is always invaluable. In this particular instance, there is the Grove, the house itself, that one over there, that was it a few years before 1861, the stables and the walled garden and the park, which is in that area. And as the design developed, this history was really important. That's the house now. History binds ideas together in a multiplicity of interacting strands. In gardens and landscapes, architectural and horticultural strands weave in and out of each other. The arts and crafts period of the 50 years, 30 years, around 1900, is an important turning point. And although design objectives and techniques have moved on, in some ways, particularly in the domestic field, the arts and crafts strand has never really gone away. The unity of architecture, interiors and gardens, an intimacy of scale, a procession of contrasting spaces and architectural components are still commonplace in many modern country and suburban gardens. I'm going to start with a look at gardens and plants in the 19th century, just to get it into its full context. Many of these stupendous display gardens were still around and exerting some influence, even if a contrary one, on garden making into the 20th century. The Revivalist gardens of the 19th century were inspired by a multiplicity of styles, which were loosely classified as Italianate, as at Harwood by Barry, or French. Here we see the Horticultural Society garden at Kensington by W.A. Nesfield, which was distinguished by quite a lot of parterre de broderie in it. There was also the Dutch style of garden, illustrated here at Bridge End in Saffron Walden and at Levens Hall, which is associated primarily with topiary, although this seemed to be confused with the idea of the supposed medieval or Tudor gardens. From the 1850s, architectural topiary became widespread. In time, it was associated with the arts and crafts garden. What had started as revivalism morphed into the new domestic garden. Now, by 1800, new plants were flooding into Europe. The greenhouse, the horticultural magazine, that's Robinson's The Garden, and the invention of the Wardian Case, there's a Wardian Case, in particular, was really important. This box here was sealed and glazed, and it contains plants which can sustain an atmosphere over a long period, despite variations in temperature and rainfall. This is because the plants absorb carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. It was used successfully to protect young plants being transported from distant countries back to Europe, and it allowed plants to go the other way, which was very beneficial to the distribution of economic crops around the world. Invented by Dr. Nathaniel Ward. With the help of greenhouses, carpet bedding became possible, in which immense numbers of tender annuals, as you can see at Longford Castle in Wiltshire, could be set out, raised, ready for planting all at once. They were then taken up after flowering, while another batch was then planted. The primary bedding plants included Pelargonium, that's this one, Lobelia erinus, that one, and Salvia scandens from Brazil, which is that one there. These replaced the gravels, sands, and crushed shells that had been used hitherto. A brave restoration of the style has been undertaken at Wadston for the last 20 years or so, doubtless at a colossal cost given the thousands of plants required each season. However, the result is sensational and worth seeing. It's rarely seen today, but it was a technique which was still widely used in 1900, which is our focal time. Meanwhile, the arts and crafts movement, which you all know about, was coming to life. William Morris was born in 1834. Like Pugin and Ruskin, was an important social thinker and reformer. He was influenced by medievalism at Oxford. He became closely involved with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Through his work with decorative arts, he and his collaborators had a profound influence on design thinking amongst architects and artists. Both Ruskin and Morris paved the way for the arts and crafts revolution with design based on simplicity and utility, reflecting apparently happier pre-industrial days, although I wonder about that a bit. In all of this, nature played a fundamental part. Here's nature in fine needlework, here's nature in glass, somebody killing somebody else, and roses on the wall. At Oxford, he met the Gothic revival architect Philip Webb, and later they designed the Red House in Kent, where Morris lived from 1859 to 1865. It was later inhabited by Charles Home. It is one of the earliest buildings of the arts and crafts movement, characterized by the highest levels of craftsmanship and artistic collaboration. House and garden were conceived as one, with the house enveloped by an orchard and the well acting as a visual hinge around the L-shaped plan. There's the sort of simplicity of the interiors, which was important in arts and crafts. There's Philip Webb looking a bit sad about the whole thing, not quite sure why. Of prime importance in this story was the establishment of the Art Workers Guild in 1884 by a group of architects, mainly from Norman Shaw's office, who became associated with the ideas of William Morris. The Guild promoted the unity of all the arts, although it took time for the cultivation of plants to get a look in. The Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, there's the poster, followed in 1887. In the last decade of the 19th century, specialist magazines became as important to the development of architecture and the applied arts as they were for gardening. The Studio was founded in 1893 by Charles Home, that's that one, with a cover by Aubrey Beardsley. And it gave air to architects like Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Charles Voysey. Country Life, founded in 1897 by Edward Hudson, encouraged Lutyens and Lorimer. The support of these magazines was really important to the development of the careers of artists and architects, just as it is today. Managing publicity well is as fundamental as design skill. Several members of the Art Workers Guild were involved with gardens. Despite the growing esteem of the professional head gardener, it was still the norm that the architect should control both the house and its setting. Whether the garden should be formal or naturalistic gave rise to a fabulously ill-natured argument between Sedding and Blomfield on the one hand and William Robinson on the other. The architects not only designed with limited attention to horticultural possibilities, but also wrote persuasively about treating gardens as part of the architecture. However, just like Robinson, they emphatically rejected the bedding layouts of the Victorian era. Oh, sorry. John Sedding, who's this one, born in 1838, was actually the second master of the Art Workers Guild. He was primarily a church architect, and his practice was a cradle to the arts and crafts movement. Ernest Gimson, Ernest Barnsley, and Herbert Iverson all worked in his office. He encouraged, along with Blomfield, the revival of so-called Jacobean features in gardens, such as terraces, covered walks, bowling greens, clipped yews, and topiary. His book, Garden Craft, Old and New, drew the especial vituperation of Robinson. Reginald Blomfield, that's this guy here, became involved. He was born in 1856. He became involved with the Art Workers Guild through Edward Pryor. He was a gifted writer, and his first book, Formal Gardens in England, was illustrated by Francis Inigo Thomas, and it appeared in 1892. He suggested that the Tudor garden or Jacobean garden could serve as a model for new gardens, and not surprisingly, his views also caused Robinson much grief. The book, however, helped Blomfield build his career with projects at Mellestane in the Borders, Goddington and Chequers, and many others. There's a bit of Goddington. That canal appears many, many times in arts and crafts gardens. Then we come to the Inigos, Inigo Thomas and Inigo Triggs. Now, Inigo Thomas was responsible for Athelhampton, which was one of several West Country gardens based on this rather sort of Jacobean idea. Inigo Triggs drew this Montacute house there, that garden pavilion, and Inigo Thomas, I've got to get this right. Yeah, Inigo Thomas illustrated Blomfield's book. They're so confusing, these two. But anyway, what wonderful draftsmanship. That's Canons Ashby, Rousham, and Melbourne in Derbyshire. Then we come to Edward Pryor. He was another Art Workers Guild man, and he was very important as an educationalist. He started, for example, the School of Architecture at Cambridge, and he was a leading authority on Gothic architecture. And he was quite as fertile in his invention as Voysey or Lutyens. The barn at Exmouth and Home Place Kelling, that's the barn at Exmouth, that's Home Place Kelling in Norfolk. Both had a butterfly plan. That's actually the one in Exmouth. And distinctive colours and patterning on the wall surfaces. They both used reinforced concrete and extensive external decoration. And of course, the buildings and their interiors are fully integrated with the garden and its surroundings. Robert Lorimer was quite a player as well. He was inspired by the long tradition of Scots tower houses and their walled gardens. He adopted the rather vertical look of houses in Scotland and the tradition of walls and hedges in the gardens. After exposure to the arts and crafts movement in London, he worked for G.F. Bodley, I think. He worked on Kelly Castle near Fife, which his father acquired in 1878. He rebuilt walls and divided the garden into compartments with long grass walks, creating something that he felt matched the ancient appearance of the castle. He believed that gardens should be formal and integrated with the house. At Earl's Hall in 1892, he created a garden echoing the antiquity of the newly rehabilitated tower house. It's in this drawing here of Inigo Triggs' vast tome of 1900, actually drawn by L. Rome Guthrie. It's defined the garden by clipped holly and yew hedges and topiary, which he lifted in large sizes from an old garden in Edinburgh. And for all anyone knew, it was the original 17th century Scottish garden. And of course, believe it or not, it earned a statutory dose of invective from Robinson. While setting Blomfield, Triggs and Pryor really let the big architectural idea dominate their designs, Lorimer seems to have been a bit more in tune with a sense of place. His compositions were properly Scottish, and it is clear that he tried hard to make them so. But not every architect and furniture builder was a member of the Art Workers Guild. Encouraged by Morris, Ernest Gimson, 1864, he was born. It was a good year, 1864. I think Lorimer was born then as well. Went to work in London, where he met Ernest and Sidney Barnsley. I think there's a bit of a kind of, not a class thing, an ambition thing here, because if you wanted to be a successful architect, you were called Inigo. But if you were a kind of artisan furniture maker, you were called Ernest, I think. In 1893, anyway, all these three, the Barnsleys and Gimson, went away from the metropolis and retired to Sapperton in the Cotswolds. They all built houses in the area and gardens distinguished by small formal terraces, very unshowy, surrounded by dry stone walls. This was a treatment that characterized several Cotswold gardens that they designed. Perhaps most important of these was Martin Manor, designed by Ernest Barnsley, which was built by hand with local materials by local labourers. It was furnished throughout by the designs of the Barnsleys and Norman Jewson. The gardens and hedged compartments and make a happy contrast between the formality and the informality of the planting. That's the summer house at Rodmartin. That, incidentally, is the kind of team photograph of the Barnsleys and Gimson. The Rodmartin serves as a fine example of arts and crafts philosophy, planning and detail. It was all set up by Claude Biddulph, who I believe his family may still live there, actually. Norman Jewson worked with the group, and in 1925 he purchased Upton Manor, also in the Cotswolds, which was basically medieval, that's it there, with later additions. It features in Jekyll and Weaver's gardens for small country houses, and it has this dramatic drawing by F.L. Griggs, who also lived nearby at Camden. Perhaps Jewson's greatest contribution to the movement was the care of Ulpen. Time and space does not really allow me to do justice to three major arts and crafts architects who widened the expression of the movement, but who are not particularly well known for their gardens. C.R. Mackintosh is here represented at Hill House in Helensburgh, Bailey Scott at Undershaw near Guildford, and Voysey at Hill House in Hazelmere. That was 1897. They were all very thoughtful about their settings and the immediate surroundings of the buildings, and they tended to collaborate with others to actually get the planting, particularly Mawson and Jekyll. And there, just because I couldn't resist, it's got to be the most uncomfortable chair in the world, but isn't it? It's superb to look at, and a piece of a sideboard by Voysey. And so we come to the other side of the coin. While the simplicity and vernacular style of the arts and crafts movement was emerging, so too was a more subtle understanding of the use of plants. At the forefront was William Robinson, born in 1838, and he lived 97 years, dying in 1935. He trained as a gardener in Ireland, but he found his niche in journalism. He detested the way plants were used in formal gardens. It wasn't ever a case that he didn't like them. Robinson wasn't like that. He detested them. In 1870, he published his antidote, The Wild Garden, in which he advocated more natural and less formal-looking plantings. He reacted strongly against the high Victorian patterned gardening, which paraded acres of greenhouse plants. He was, in fact, rather in sympathy with the ideas of Ruskin and Morris. He was interested in the idea of the cottage garden, a discussion promoted by his own gardening journal, The Garden, launched in 1871, and his many books. This is the kind of thing he liked. That's a path flanked by primroses in Surrey. That's Warley Place, which belonged to Ellen Wilmot, with some wonderful daffodil plantings and a superb oak tree there. In 1885, he bought Gravetime Manor in Sussex. Over the years, he transformed both house and garden. For the architectural work, he commissioned Ernest George, whose pupil, Lutyens, found Robinson exasperating, boring, and full of contradictions, and unnecessarily rude to boot. Robinson was at this time at full tilt against what he called the phrasemongering of Sedding and Blomfield, but in his remodelling of Gravetye, he eventually adopted the flat stone terraces suggested by Blomfield. In the best arts and crafts manner, Robinson considered the flower garden opening out directly from doors in the house as just a larger living room, just the kind of thing that Sedding or Blomfield would have approved. But for all that, he kept up his attacks on the architectural treatment of plants. Christopher Lloyd's father, the target in this one. So now for the book Garden Craftsmanship in Yew and Box by Nathaniel Lloyd, officer of the most excellent order of the British Empire. It is the poorest book that so far has disgraced the garden. In looking at distortions, the first feeling was a vexation, but it soon turned to pity that an artist in any shape should call his work as shown in his book art. Robinson had an overwhelming passion for plants, with lakes full of water lilies. There we are. Miles of clematis and wisteria, and his walled kitchen garden, there was an unsurpassed collection of vegetables and fruits. He established a bank of azaleas and another of heathers. He collected newly introduced trees and shrubs, such as Davidia involucrata, introduced from China in 1904. He also responded to and included the greater landscape beyond. While developing his flower gardens, he was buying up neighboring farms and planted carefully managed woodlands with native plants and sweeps of thousands of daffodils. In time, his estate acquired a naturalistic beauty similar to an 18th century picturesque landscape. There's Gravetye today, and you can go and stay there because it's a hotel. But the gap was closing, and the work of Harold Peto helped. He was the son of the railway contractor Samuel Morton Peto, a product of the Industrial Revolution, if ever there was one. In 1876, Peto went into partnership with the architect Ernest George. While George designed the houses, Peto managed the practice and started to get interested in Italian Renaissance gardens. However, ill health compelled Peto to leave London. During these years, he traveled extensively to Italy, America, Spain, and Greece. In 1899, Peto purchased Iford Manor in Wiltshire, which he made his permanent base. There it is over the local river. He redesigned and expanded the garden, trying out new ideas and incorporating the artifacts collected during his travels around the world, such as those two columns from Ravenna, I think. The garden at Iford illustrates particularly his arts and crafts approach to architecture and garden design. It was also for him his working garden laboratory, which gave him a practical experience and quite an understanding about planting. That's a lovely little cloister, which occasionally they used to have operas in. You sat around the outside. In fact, it looks as though it's been set up for just that. You see the chairs. Most of Peto's major commissions were executed between 1900 and 1914, including, amongst others, work at Easton Lodge, Essex. Look at that pergola, what a cracker. West Dean House, where there's another pergola, and Busket Park in Oxfordshire, where he did these wonderful canals. Also important was Garnish Island in County Cork, that's the Italian garden there, and a series of gardens in the Mediterranean. Remarkably, Robinson felt that Peto had gone some way towards understanding the horticultural importance of gardens. Thomas Mawson was a giant amongst early 20th century garden designers and planners who bridged the gap between horticulture and architecture, and indeed planning as well. Born in Lancashire, he had a modest start, leaving school at the age of 12. After working in his father's building business, he joined a London nursery, gaining experience in landscape gardening. Moving back north in the 1880s, he started the Lakeland Nursery in Windermere and took up design. His first commission was for Colonel Sands at Graythwaite Hall in 1889, where he successfully both deployed his knowledge of horticulture and of building. From there, he went on to design many other Cumbrian gardens, such as Brockhole, that's that one. These terrace projects, linking house and view and contrasting with informal groupings of shrubs, showed a sympathy for the arts and crafts principles. He was sensitive to the physical context of his work in his use of materials and his response to views and levels, and his familiarity with plants. Typical of his work at this time was Little On Hall in Staffordshire, where he skillfully reworked an existing but derelict house and garden. In 1891, he won a competition to design and construct Bellevue Park in Newport, Monmouthshire. That led to work for the Corey family of horticultural fame at Diffrin Gardens, there's the house, which was highly plant-oriented. He was then appointed the landscape designer for Glyn Corey Garden Village, which was the first garden suburb in Wales, which may have given him a taste for planning. He went on to design gardens and parks in various parts of Britain, Europe, and even Canada. In 1908, he won a competition to lay out the Peace Palace Gardens at The Hague, that's them, which were only partially executed, presumably because of the war. He lectured frequently on civic design and contributed articles to the Studio magazine. In 1923, he became president of the Town Planning Institute, and in 1929, he was elected the first president of the Institute of Landscape Architects. Not bad for a boy who left school at the age of 12. In his book, The Art and Craft of Garden Making, which he published himself in 1900, it was always modest enough to acknowledge his debt to collaborators, both architects and draftsmen, such as Charles Mallows, Frederick Griggs, Dan Gibson, Bailey Scott, Voysey, and something I only discovered looking at it again today was that he dedicated it to Colonel Sands, who gave him such a good start. He did that one for him. So we come on to these two. Collaboration. The creation of good gardens certainly needs, to some extent, inventive wit. But more than that, it requires knowledge, research, and collaboration, sometimes between primary creators and always between designers, contractors, and gardeners. To hope that one head will master all the complexities of garden and landscape design and its execution is optimistic. Probably only Thomas Mawson got anywhere near it. However, the Jekyll and Lutyens collaboration just shows how great the achievement can be when two highly motivated and skilled designers work symbiotically. By the 1880s, the English cottage garden, which was a somewhat romanticized reaction to the formal Victorian garden, was having a significant influence on the gardening ideas of both Robinson and Jekyll. She appreciated the wildness promoted by Robinson, but saw also that control and structure was needed. Collaborating with Lutyens, she brought together Robinson's view that plants themselves should be respected, and the need for them to be given a controlled setting was important. Her control, however, went beyond the architectural, and she more or less invented the idea of tonal or color control. She in fact came up with a new version of the display garden, much more subtle, but a display garden nonetheless. Edwin Lutyens was born in 1869. He had a brief spell with Ernest George before starting his own practice in 1888. At this time, he met Gertrude Jekyll and he shared her enthusiasm for the vernacular. Appointed architect for our new house at Munstead Wood, he came up with an imaginative interpretation of the local Surrey vernacular. Jekyll's gardens, designed with Lutyens, best encapsulate the arts and crafts approach to garden making. They're pretty much the perfect expression of the symbiotic nature of house and garden. At Munstead, her garden had no prescribed plan, but it evolved over time and was well developed before the house was built, which is pretty remarkable, really. With great skill, Lutyens found a way of marrying the house with the pre-existing garden. In the woodland gardens, she was much influenced by Robinson's ideas. That's the view in from the south coming up there, and that's the way into the north from the main part of the garden going in there. She also made space for seasonal gardens, such as a spring garden or one filled with September asters, which we saw at the beginning. Here is the June garden of lupins and iris. Of particular importance was the main flower border, 61 meters long by 4 meters deep, backed by a high sandstone wall, which separated it from the spring garden. The border's complex and intricate color scheme was based on harmonious color relationships, with reds in the center fading to orange and deep yellow. They continue to fade to pale yellow and pink, finishing at both ends with blues and lilacs in a ground of grey foliage. Of the 15 acres of garden, 2 were given over to working gardens, including a kitchen garden, a nursery, and a large orchard. And I learnt through the kind offices of the head gardener a couple of days ago that this was done with a head gardener plus 4 or 5 staff. And occasionals, I suppose, when there was a lot of work to do, which strikes me as being remarkably few for the techniques that she employed. So they must have worked jolly hard. So between them, they dreamt up many wonderful gardens, or I should say places. And perhaps these early ones seem to be the most imaginative. They had complex plantings within a structural architecture of terraces, walls, hedges, stairs, and often water. Christopher Hussey, a later architectural editor of Country Life, thought that the combination of Jekyll's naturalistic planting and Lutyens' geometry settled the controversy between Blomfield and Robinson of formal versus naturalistic design. But this page shows the most phenomenal invention. That's orchards of 1897, Goddard's of 1898, Deanery of 1899, Marsh Court 1901, and there are quite a few others during this period. 4 years for that lot. I mean, it's mind-blowing, really. Then a couple of years after that, 1903, Hestercombe in Somerset is another wonderful example of their collaboration. Lutyens designed the terraces below the house to enjoy the views across the Vale of Taunton over there. And they culminated in a great parterre framed by long pergolas at the end and flanked by rills, which are part of an elaborate water garden. There are the rills, and there is the pergola there. So there's a rill and there's a rill. Lutyens excelled himself connecting all the level changes in a marvelous geometry. Jekyll contrasted her plant colors with the stone, using on the top terraces the hot and cool palette, which she had perfected at Munstead Wood. Now this one, Upton Grey, was not a collaboration with Lutyens. Manor House, Upton Grey, is one of her best surviving private gardens, thanks to the dedicated input of Ros Wallinger, who restored it. It was the home of Charles Home, founder of the studio, who lived there for 20 years after moving from the Red House in 1902. The formal garden on the east side is a series of descending grass terraces, that's that long, which are divided by low stone walls filled with wall plants, which are mostly pink and grey. The pergolas are festooned with roses, clematis, and other climbers. The rose garden divided into geometric beds, that's that there, is planted with roses and peonies and interplanted with lilies. In contrast, the main borders are more strongly coloured and graded like at Munstead Wood. I've seen it written, I don't know, it might have been by Judith Tankard, that she didn't actually get very far after with her invention after Munstead Wood. Anyway, a large wild garden on the west side has informal design and naturalistic plantings. The mown grass paths wind through the long grass and trees, and the marginals in the pond at the end. And in the spring, the whole of it is covered with daffodils, snowdrops, scillas, and so on. Now, alongside all of this, there were the gardens where nobody really bothered too much about architects or design theories. All through the 19th century and even more into the 20th, plant collecting gathered pace. Many imported plants found their way into botanic gardens. Kew was important, promoting plant hunting expeditions from the 18th century onwards, as were the great private collections such as at Killerton in Devon, where John Veitch and his plant hunters imported thousands of new plants. At Biddulph Grange, James Bateman, that's these two, James Bateman created the gardens around 1840 with the aid of his friend Edward Cook, a painter, to display his wide-ranging collection of plants. And as it happened, Cook was not just a keen designer, but his father-in-law owned one of the biggest plant nurseries of the day, Loddiges of Hackney, and Bateman was the beneficiary. His gardens are unusual in the 19th century and rather prefigured an arts and crafts approach. They are compartmentalized into themes and collections such as Egypt and China. That's the way into Egypt, as well as more conventional terraces and walks. The different areas of the garden are hidden from each other using piles of rocks and thickly planted shrubberies as a way of creating a romantic yet informative garden. It was as good as anything else designed in the 19th century, and he invented the original wormhole. You go in through Egypt and you come out in China. At Bodnant over here in North Wales, the scientist Henry Pochin, who was born in 1824, I think, established the gardens in 1874, filling them with plants collected by the great plant hunters such as Ernest Wilson, George Forrest, and Harold Comber. Pochin was an industrial chemist who owned China clay pits in Cornwall, one of which is now the Eden Project. It is somewhat ironic that Pochin should have created such horticultural beauty at Bodnant on the back of China clay moonscapes of Cornwall. In Sussex, the Loder family founded 3 significant gardens for their plant collections. Sir Robert Loder, 1861, he was born, was a paterfamilias, and he started the garden at High Beeches, which is this one. It concentrates on species plants in a naturalistic style. His son Edmund created Leonard's Lee, that's that one, 240 acres in a sheltered valley of former hammer ponds, perfectly suited to rhododendrons, camellias, and magnolias. In 1902, Gerald, another son, purchased the Wakehurst estate, which in 1936 he sold to Sir Henry Price, who continued to develop the gardens, and he bequeathed them with the estate to the National Trust, which has subsequently leased them to Kew. The Loder's enthusiasm for plant collecting took advantage of the many expeditions undertaken by notable plant hunters such as Harold Comber, George Forrest, and Frank Kingdom Ward. Subscribers were able to buy shares in these expeditions and receive seeds in exchange. Then there was Arnold Rosschild, who purchased the 200-acre Exbury estate with its requisite lime-free soil in 1919, and soon set to creating a garden on a huge scale. He installed a mighty infrastructure to supply water, as well as building acres of glass to hybridize plants and maintain orchids. Like the Loaders and others, Larnell sponsored plant hunters to bring back plants and seeds to grow on and possibly hybridize. He thought that he could replicate in large-scale woodland gardening the ideas that Jekyll and Robinson had achieved in domestic planting and in the wild garden. He collected rhododendrons, camellias, magnolias by the score and moved them around in the garden until they looked about right. His collection of rare trees and shrubs was prodigious, and one of his collectors, Frank Kingdom Ward, I learnt only today, declared in a letter that this was the 8th wonder of the world. Quite an accolade. Astonishingly, all of this was achieved within 20 years before being interrupted by the Second World War. And as a sign of the times, whereas Larnell had 70 gardeners between the wars, I'm told, there are now only 9. It is quite a challenge to maintain its richness and diversity. And I get all of my information about this from my partner, Mary-Louise Aegis, who's worth at least another 9. So moving on, with the increasing availability of all kinds of plants, many gardens starting with an arts and crafts simplicity get more complicated. The room sequence design evolving from the architectural approach helps keep the design legible. Idcut, purchased by Lawrence Johnson in 1907, is complex both spatially and in its plantings. Its outdoor rooms have various characters and themes enclosed by hedges and stone walls. They are linked by paths or vistas. Some are distinguished by topiary, some have ponds and fountains. That's the bathing pond, that one. And all are planted with an abundance of flowering material. It's a grand creation that goes well beyond intimacy and simplicity. Great Dixter in East Sussex was built in 1910 by Nathaniel Lloyd and Lutyens, who combined an existing mid-15th century house with a similar structure brought over from Benenden a few miles away in Kent. The garden, as we've seen, with its great yew hedges and copious topiary, earned the statutory displeasure of Robinson. It was Lloyd's son, Christopher, of course, who really put it on the map. He used its arts and crafts structure to offset adventurous planting with bold experiments of form and colour. Change is a hallmark of this garden, even change to the structure. The garden is currently managed by Fergus Garrett, another imaginative plantsman, who drives forward change and experiment. This garden, more than most, illustrates what can be lost by a preservationist approach to gardens and buildings. Had the heavy hand of planning and so-called conservation been deployed negatively, then years of learning and pleasure would have been denied a curious public. There would have been no marriage of barns for a start. That's the one that came from Benenden. There's the sunken garden and the high garden and wonderfully Lutyens-esque steps. Can one be Lutyens-esque? It'll do anyway. Sissinghurst Castle in Kent was bought by Vita Sackville West and her husband Harold Nicholson in 1930. Over 30 years ago or so, they transformed a rundown farm into one of the world's most influential gardens. He planned the layout based on actual walks opening into enclosed spaces, while she undertook the planting. Among the individual spaces, the White Garden has been particularly well known and influential. At the same time, she cultivated hundreds of roses and other flowering shrubs. It's worth noting that Edwin Lutyens was a friend and gave advice concerning Long Barn, where they lived before, and Sissinghurst. However, Vita Sackville West does not appear to have been much of a fan of Gertrude Jekyll, and in particular, she disliked herbaceous borders, even though she had a propensity for grouping flower colour. So what is happening today? Many new domestic gardens are being created in which the unity of house and garden as a guiding principle persists. Sometimes existing arts and crafts masterpieces are being nurtured into the 21st century by skilled horticulturalists. At Folly Farm, for example, one of Lutyens' most imaginative buildings, Dan Pearson has been restoring the planting. It says much for the strength of the Lutyens design that 110 years later, a plantsman using modern plants in a modern way can create a magic as great as Jekyll's. Then at Mount St John in Yorkshire, Tom Stuart Smith developed a series of terraces that link directly back to the house and out to the distant landscape. They're planted with a profusion that is beautifully controlled and requires an owner and a head gardener wholly signed up to the vision. Gardening at this level is very much a collaborative endeavour. Although a hotel, the Grove has a spatial coherence and intimacy, which is entirely arts and crafts. I was responsible for this, and furthermore, the brief allowed me to superimpose a 21st century layer on a 19th century layout, which was easily readable. The planting colours and textures were designed to support the spatial form, and it seems to be appreciated by the visitors, which is quite important. For me, it was particularly satisfying experience having a client who had fully bought into the scheme, as in this case, not only could he see the aesthetic benefits, but also the commercial. So to conclude, the 30 years around 1900 saw considerable change both horticulturally and architecturally. The palette of basic plant material was continually growing, and the great collections around the country, both public and private, show an astonishing 500 years of global plant acquisition. Also, horticultural shows and journals spread the word, introducing the public to a fascinating and increasingly obtainable range of plants. Consequently, the arts and crafts movement was a happy development for the garden. Not only was it a reaction against the great Victorian gardens, but it was also a period of considerable invention. It introduced an intimacy into gardens not really seen before. It achieved a more human scale. An alternative sensibility promoted by Robinson, Mawson and Jekyll worked well with the houses of Foisy, Bailey Scott, Lutyens and many others. The constraints of the architectural garden helped contain the diversity and abundance of planting material to produce gardens of extraordinary horticultural interest, as well as excitement, pleasure and satisfaction. What is more, these results were achieved by a real collaboration amongst artists, architects, gardeners and builders. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson for us today. There was less room for the prima donna designer and more for mutual respect. While there is no substitute for inventive imagination, the best gardens and landscapes can only be achieved through thoughtful research, trial, measured evaluation, and full collaboration of all participants from client to the digger driver or from architect to nurseryman. Garden making can and should be a communal exercise which would earn the approval of Ruskin or Morris. Thank you very much. I must now have a drink. God blimey.
Well, while you're having a very well-earned drink, I know that if we were in a room, there would be thunderous applause to that. That really was the most fantastic talk. You danced with great grace through a huge period of history. In innumerable number of fascinating designers, many of whom I'm sure will be well known to people, but not getting stuck on history, but rather giving a wonderful explanation of the context in which they were designing their likes and dislikes, which are often far more interesting. And you built a picture as it went through that took us on such a clear narrative, and it was very nice to see the end of just really being able to reflect on where things are today. So I'm a huge thank you for that. Everything I could have hoped for in organizing this and much more. I'm glad to see that there are questions beginning to flow in. Please add your questions to the Q&A at the bottom. But I think so selfishly, as chair here, I'm going to strike in with the first one, if that's all right. I mean, you touched right at the beginning of your influence as a designer that uses history, and you've also mentioned towards the end there the importance to strike a strike a balance with the need to evolve gardens. I mean, actually, that was a theme that came through, I think, in the talk quite clearly. I'm interested in a comment you made on Great Dixter at the end there, of the constraints of planning. Might you enlarge on that? I mean, I think I recognise it from probably my architectural background, but I'm interested in what you alluded to there.
Well, planning and gardens is very difficult because gardens don't stay still. Actually, buildings don't stay still either, but particularly gardens don't stay still. Plants grow, they get disease, the wind blows them over, all sorts of things. And as far as Great Dixter was concerned, I knew Christopher Lloyd quite well, relatively well. And from time to time, we'd sit down and chew the fat. And one of the issues which came up was what would happen to Great Dixter after he died. And he was adamant that a garden should not be preserved, that it should always be a changing canvas. And indeed, I remember him during his years, latter years there, doing some quite major changes, like, for example, the rose garden, which everybody loved, apparently. He decided he wanted to turn into a sort of tropical jungle type garden. And admittedly, he was only changing the planting there, but there was some areas where he took down hedges, took down trees, reformed the spaces in different kind of ways, changed flooring materials, for example, in the dog garden. He was up for change the whole time, and I think he was right. I think that gardens should evolve. There should never be an attempt to preserve them in aspic. It's easier probably to do that with the planting than it is to do that with the structure. But you know, we've got, what is it, 500,000 listed buildings in the UK, of which an awful lot have gardens which are effectively listed because of the structure, which falls into the 50-year rule. So you can't change the structure without getting listed planning consent. And I feel that people should be more imaginative. That, you know, it's a bit of a cop-out, just preservation, saying we've got to preserve things. There's an awful lot of stuff which is already preserved, and I think that a better solution is to be more imaginative with it.
Well, that leads rather nicely into one of the questions we've had. Sadly, an anonymous person, but who asks, curious to know how contemporary gardeners attempt to preserve original colour schemes in the gardens. Did the designers assume change and development over time, or will they hope for their original plan and colour schemes to be retained or remain?
Well, I personally believe that people will use the best plants available. I mean, it's very interesting what Ros Wallinger has done at Upton Grey. I mean, I think she's made a big effort to get hold of original material, but a lot of original varieties have actually just completely disappeared. There was a book once by Chris Brickell, I think, about when a thing called the NCCPG, the National Council for Conservation of Plants and Gardens, was set up, and he listed so many plants and varieties which had completely disappeared, so they couldn't be used today. And I think that, again, it's, if somebody can get those plants, fine, do it as a one-off museum piece, as a fine example of museumism, but I don't think that one should necessarily be forced to do so in a replanting an old structure. I think one should be able to use new plants.
There are a couple of questions in here which I will come back to. I know that I'm not going in order. I just want to have one more question on this sort of subject of balancing new intervention into gardens, and it's actually back to your experience at the Grove, and just trying to perhaps elaborate a little bit further on that, on the challenges that you had of balancing the modern and historic, and you know the view on that sort of conundrum on a more personal basis with your own project experience.
Well, as far as the Grove went, to all intents and purposes, it was a completely new garden. And the reason for that was we had the old house, the 18th century house by Taylor and Matthew Brettingham, I think, took it over. And at some distance were the stables. There was a new modern link made between the two. So instead of having two separated buildings, you then had a big long U-shaped building. If you follow me, it's a sort of shallow U. And that effectively changed the space that I was playing around with. Having said that, there were things which I could pick up from the old building, which still existed. The position of the rose garden, for example, still existed, and it was in the right place with where two axes crossed, one axis from the old house, a new axis from part of the new extension. And so I could build up enough of a grid, as it were, to show the old garden layout. But on top of that, there were desire lines which went in a different kind of way, which I could express in a rather sinuous line, which overlaid the old grid. And it started to get really interesting. It was the most extraordinary kind of areas for planting. And in addition to what I'm saying is there were the existing trees, the cedars in that formal garden, which we had to watch out for and to work around, which combined to allow me to create this new 21st century, I call it, sinuous grid overlying the rectilinear grid. And it was very inventive, and I mean, it produced some wonderful places in that garden. So I think at the Grove, I actually had a lot of luck, but it was the site that gave me the luck. And it was the client who actually said, yeah, that's a good idea, let's roll with it. I mean, what one must always remember is that clients are part of the team. And if you've got an imaginative client, you'll end up with luck having an imaginative garden at the end of it.
Well, ultimately, as they always say, they're the ones who have to foot the bill, but it goes beyond.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't go beyond the cost, and actually it leads very nicely into another of the questions where the reflection is that the arts and crafts, much of the arts and crafts movement was supposed to be very democratic, and yet a lot of the gardens seem very expensive to make, and therefore presumably only for the elite.
Well, I don't know. I think it's sort of interesting in that the gardens, the houses and gardens today would be colossally expensive, yes, but building and labor was 100 years ago was a great deal cheaper. So were they so expensive then? I need a 19th century economist to tell me. No, an economist who specializes in 19th century building to tell me.
And indeed, there were as you said, the earnests of the movement as well, who were doing much more probably sort of lower key gardens as well. I mean, I think some of the examples you've shown are of very large statement pieces, but equally those lessons transcend into much smaller pockets as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that places like Elpen were pretty big, and Rod Martin's pretty big, but there was all the stuff that Barnsley and Gimson were doing in Sapperton was very modest, really.
Yeah. And you only have to read some of their reflections of the time to see the very modest lives that they lived.
Oh, you were talking about Jewson's book, weren't you?
Yeah, from Whence I Drove, an excellent book if you want a quick canter through what these people were, how some of them were aspiring to live. I suppose we've been focusing on largely on projects in the UK, with a couple of examples from further afield in Italy and Ireland. But there's a question from, or I suppose, yes, I suppose a question from Wendy Bentel saying that were you aware that Robinson had designed a garden in India?
No, absolutely not.
The garden was being maintained by rather wonderful sari-clad ladies.
I'd love to. No, I certainly wasn't. I'd love to see some pics.
Yeah, so would I. Well, perhaps if you have any pics, Randy, you might be able to email them to the Lutyens Trust, and we can forward them on and have a look. Or indeed, I think Michael's email is on his website.
The other, just to interrupt on Robinson, though, the other thing which is quite extraordinary is that he did, and I haven't seen the drawings or photographs, he did some planting at Shrublands Park in Suffolk, I think it is, which was a berry garden. So that was a real collision of Barry, of course, would have done a colossal Italian job at Shrublands. And then for it to be planted or replanted, in fact, by Robinson must have been a very strange mix.
Yeah. I would be very interested to know sort of how the wealth of knowledge and experience that was forming at this time at the, I suppose, the end of, so in the dying years of British colonialism. I suppose it had a few more years to go, but would have been seen to transfer around the wider Commonwealth. But perhaps that's a subject for another talk.
Well, yes, and I think that it would be great to get somebody to talk about gardens and the arts and crafts in America, because there was it was alive and kicking there, and I'm afraid I would have loved to have talked a bit about it, but I haven't really got enough knowledge to do it well. But people like Beatrice Farrand, for example, must have had a huge influence.
And indeed, I mean, of course, there's all the work on parks and wider landscapes as well. But as I said, time has not been on our side, but you have covered an amazing amount, and really has been an absolutely fantastic talk. So a huge thank you again for your time this evening, and for everyone here who has joined us. If you've enjoyed it and not a member, please do sign up. If you know people who aren't members, please go and find them and help them sign up. And I believe, and I say I believe because I'm just trying to finalize the final talk of this series, which, if it happens, will be on art around this time. So keep an eye on the website, and we will send out emails. And again, later in the year, we will be running a series of lectures looking at memorials. Hopefully, with the changes in COVID restrictions, we may possibly be able to organise some walking tours. I think house visits will probably most likely be off the cards, but we will do all we can as an events committee to carry on putting on events for you, the members. So keep an eye on the website. And in the meantime, a huge thank you again, and thank you all for joining, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Not at all. It's a pleasure.